Money doesn't make you free. The psychology behind money does, and most people spend their entire lives chasing the first one without ever understanding the second. Here's something nobody in the financial world wants to say out loud, because the entire industry runs on you not knowing it. Your relationship with money was never really about money. It was about control. Who has it? Who was taught to give it away? Who was conditioned, long before their first paycheck arrived, to believe that their role in the financial world was that of a participant rather than an architect? And the conditioning started so early and ran so deep that most people carry it like oxygen, completely invisible, completely necessary, never once questioned. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote something that every banker, every employer, every institution that profits from other people's financial passivity understood instinctively, even if they never read a word he wrote. He said that men are governed more by appearances than by reality, and that the prince who understands this controls not just behavior but belief. The most powerful financial control in the world is not a locked vault, it's a belief system. And yours was installed before you were old enough to question it. Drop this in the comments right now. Say, I control my money. My money doesn't control me. Because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how the psychology of financial control was taken from you, why most people never reclaim it, and what the people who do actually think differently about, starting at a level so fundamental that most financial content never comes close to touching it. Part 1. The first financial program you ever received. Before we talk about markets, assets, income or wealth, we need to talk about something that happened to you when you were approximately 4 years old, because that's when the programming started. Not through anyone's malicious intent, through something far more powerful, the way the adults around you talked about money. The words they used, the emotions those words carried, the fights that money caused, or the silence money created, or the constant low-grade anxiety that seemed to follow any serious conversation about finances. Children don't learn about money from textbooks. They learn about it from atmosphere, from the tension in a parent's voice when a bill arrives, from the phrases that get repeated so often they eventually stop sounding like opinions and start sounding like facts. Money doesn't grow on trees. We can't afford that. People like us don't have that kind of money. You have to work hard for every dollar you earn. These aren't just statements, they're psychological frameworks. Tiny architectural decisions being made, without anyone realizing it, about what money is, who it belongs to, and what your relationship with it is allowed to be. Machiavelli wrote that the most durable form of control is the kind the controlled never experience as control. Not chains, not force, but the quiet installation of a worldview so natural feeling, so invisible, that the person inside it never thinks to look for the walls. Most people reading their first paycheck weren't starting a financial life. They were walking into a room that had already been arranged for them by a decade of unconscious programming. Their first instinct wasn't, how do I use this to build something? It was the instinct their programming gave them. Spend, relieve, satisfy the dozen invisible financial impulses that had been building since childhood, now finally given the tool to be expressed. And the system, the employers, the retailers, the advertisers, the credit card companies who'd already researched this exact pattern before those people ever left school, was waiting patiently on the other side. Part 2. The architecture of financial helplessness. Here's a word that almost never appears in financial discussions, but explains more about how most people experience money than any other single concept. Learned helplessness. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Martin Seligman ran a series of experiments that revealed something disturbing about human psychology. He found that after a person experiences a situation where their actions have no effect on the outcome, they stop taking actions. Even when circumstances change and their actions could absolutely affect the outcome, they don't stop because they're unintelligent. They stop because their nervous system has learned, through direct experience, that effort doesn't change results. And once that lesson is learned, the brain stops generating the impulse to try. Now apply this to money. If you grew up in a household where financial effort never seemed to translate into financial progress, where parents worked hard and still struggled, where extra effort didn't visibly change the outcome, where the connection between action and financial result was broken or invisible, your nervous system learned something that Seligman would immediately recognize. It learned that financial effort doesn't change results. And that lesson, absorbed before you ever consciously engaged with money, becomes the invisible ceiling on everything that comes after. Machiavelli understood power dynamics with surgical precision. He wrote that the most effective way to keep people compliant isn't to punish action. It's to ensure that action never appears to produce results. Because a person who has tried and failed develops a theory, and once the theory is there, once the belief that trying doesn't work becomes embedded, you don't need punishment anymore. Self-limitation becomes self-perpetuating. This is not about blame, it's about understanding. Because the moment you can see the architecture of the helplessness, it stops being invisible. And the moment it stops being invisible, it starts being optional. Part 3. Why more money doesn't fix the psychology. Here's the thing that confuses almost everyone at first, because it seems like it should contradict the entire premise of this video. Giving more money to someone with an unexamined financial psychology doesn't create wealth. It creates a larger version of the same pattern. Study after study of lottery winners shows that within a few years, the majority are back to approximately the financial situation they were in before the win. Not because they're stupid, not because they're lazy, because a sudden increase in financial resources doesn't rewrite the psychological operating system. It just runs the existing one at a higher speed. The person who overspends on a modest income overspends on a large one. The person who avoids thinking about money on a small scale avoids it on a bigger one. The person whose financial identity is built around scarcity, around the belief that money is something you get, spend, and lose, rather than something you build systems around, will unconsciously recreate scarcity regardless of how much arrives. This is not a character flaw, it's a programming issue. Machiavelli wrote that a man who inherits a kingdom without understanding the principles of power will lose it faster than one who built it from nothing, because the one who built it understood, at every step, what sustained it. The inheritance without the understanding is just borrowed time. Financial windfalls, inheritances, bonuses, sudden income jumps work the same way. Without a psychological framework that matches the scale, they collapse back to the baseline the psychology was calibrated for. And here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. The financial industry knows this, not as a strategy of oppression, just as a fact that happens to be profitable. The average American receives a tax refund every year. That refund represents, on average, about $3,000. Research consistently shows that this money, for the majority of recipients, is gone within weeks, not because they're irresponsible, because the psychological relationship with that money, the frame of unexpected windfall, not regular income, triggers a specific spending psychology that the advertising industry has spent billions of dollars learning to activate at exactly this moment. The refund arrives. The ads are already waiting. Part 4. The scarcity loop that never ends. There's a psychological concept called the scarcity mindset, and it's been studied with increasing precision over the last 2 decades. What researchers found is both obvious and devastating. When a person is in a state of perceived financial scarcity, not necessarily actual poverty, just the constant psychological experience of not having enough, cognitive bandwidth narrows. The mind becomes consumed by the immediate financial problem to the exclusion of almost everything else. Long-term planning becomes nearly impossible. Impulsive decisions increase. The very thinking required to escape scarcity becomes one of the first casualties of it. In plain language, financial stress makes it psychologically harder to think your way out of financial stress. This is not weakness. This is neuroscience. The brain under genuine resource pressure behaves differently than the brain in a stable state, and a system that profits from that instability has very little incentive to disrupt it. Machiavelli wrote about a concept he called the poverty of small vision, men so consumed by the immediate crisis that they cannot perceive the larger board on which the game is being played. They fight for the next meal and never notice who controls the distribution of food. This is what the scarcity loop does at a psychological level. It keeps the mind operating at a time horizon of days, sometimes hours, while the game it's actually embedded in operates on decades. The person focused on covering this month's bills cannot simultaneously be developing the 5-year strategy that would make this month's bills irrelevant. And here's the part that stings. This isn't a failure of intelligence or ambition. It's the entirely predictable outcome of a system that introduces debt, consumption pressure, social comparison, and lifestyle inflation at the exact moment a person begins to earn, before they've developed a single psychological tool to manage the impact. You are handed the income and the credit line on the same day. The financial psychology required to use them well. Nobody hands you that. Part 5. The invisible comparison engine. Here is one of the most powerful and least discussed mechanisms behind financial behavior in the modern world, and it's become exponentially more influential in the last 15 years. Social comparison. Human beings are social animals, and we are neurologically wired to calibrate our sense of adequacy based on the people around us. This was a useful function for most of human history. It helped maintain social cohesion, establish status, and regulate behavior within groups. It is catastrophic in the context of modern consumer culture. For most of human history, the comparison group was local. You compared yourself to the people in your immediate community. Their spending set the unconscious benchmark for yours. If your neighbors had a modest car, modest house, and modest lifestyle, your psychological normal was calibrated accordingly. Then social media arrived, and suddenly the comparison group became global, curated, relentlessly aspirational. A continuous, algorithmically optimized highlight reel of everyone's best purchases, best moments, and best financial appearances, designed specifically by people who understand dopamine and comparison psychology deeply to make your current situation feel inadequate. Machiavelli wrote that the man who compares himself to princes will always feel like a peasant, regardless of what he has built, not because his achievements are small, but because the comparison itself is poison. The point of the comparison was never to motivate him, it was to ensure he never felt like enough. The financial consequence of this is direct and measurable. Consumer spending driven by social comparison rather than genuine need or considered desire is spending that reliably produces the least long-term satisfaction and the most long-term financial damage. You spend to close a gap that the algorithm is designed to keep perpetually open. The car is purchased. The algorithm shows you a better one within a week. The vacation is taken. The algorithm shows you a more impressive one before you've unpacked. The psychological gap never closes because the comparison engine was never designed to close it. It was designed to keep it open just wide enough to keep you spending. Part 6. The identity trap. Here's the deepest layer of the psychology of financial control, and it's the one most people never reach, because getting here requires being honest about something genuinely uncomfortable. Financial behavior is identity behavior. The things you spend money on aren't just purchases, they're declarations. Every financial decision sends a signal to the people around you, and more importantly to yourself, about who you are, what category you belong to, what kind of person you've become or are trying to become. This is why telling someone their financial habits are inefficient is rarely enough to change them, because you're not just addressing a behavior, you're touching an identity, and identity defense is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. Machiavelli wrote that men will endure enormous suffering rather than change a self-conception that is central to how they understand themselves in the world. Not because they're irrational, because the self-conception feels more real, more fundamental than the suffering it causes. Think about what this means for financial change. The person who defines themselves through generous spending, who sees their identity as someone who gives freely, who never lets money come before experience, who doesn't want to be that person who counts every dollar, will unconsciously sabotage any financial strategy that requires restraint, because restraint feels like a betrayal of their own identity. The person who defines themselves through self-sacrifice and financial struggle, who has absorbed, over years, a narrative that says real people don't have it easy, that wealth is for other kinds of people, that comfort is something slightly suspect, will unconsciously resist financial improvement because progress would require them to become someone whose existence contradicts their deepest self-story. This is not dramatic, it's mundane. It happens in small moments, through small decisions, across thousands of ordinary days. The spontaneous purchase that relieves a specific kind of anxiety. The practical reason not to start investing yet. The familiar justification that arrives right at the moment a genuinely different financial choice would be made. Every financial justification you've ever made that sounded logical but felt more like relief than reason, that was identity defense talking, and it will keep talking, at exactly the same volume, until the identity underneath it changes. Part 7. The control that was always available. Here's where everything in this video converges, and it's important to be precise about what financial control actually means, because the word control gets used in personal finance in a way that almost completely misses the point. Most financial advice talks about control as if it's about behaviors. Budget better, spend less, save more, track your expenses. These are not wrong. They're just operating on the surface layer of a much deeper mechanism. Changing financial behaviors without changing the psychological architecture underneath them is like repainting the outside of a house whose foundation is cracked. It looks different for a while. Then the crack shows through again. Real financial control starts with exactly what Machiavelli placed at the center of every discussion of power: self-knowledge. Not the surface version. Not, I know I spend too much on restaurants. The deeper version. Why does spending relieve a specific psychological tension? What identity is being maintained or protected by financial patterns that aren't serving you? What early programming is still running underneath your relationship with money, producing outcomes you consciously don't want, but keep somehow arriving at anyway? Machiavelli wrote that the prince who does not understand his own nature will be manipulated by it. That the first and most important conquest is not of enemies or territory, but of the self, and specifically of the parts of the self that operate without conscious permission. Your financial psychology has been operating without conscious permission for most of your life. The scarcity loop, the comparison engine, the identity armor, the learned helplessness absorbed before you ever held a dollar. None of it is permanent, none of it is destiny, but none of it changes through willpower alone. It changes through the kind of honest, unflinching self-examination that most financial content never asks you to do, because it's uncomfortable, and uncomfortable doesn't sell as well as a simpler answer. The simpler answer is more tactics, more spreadsheets, more apps. The real answer is harder and worth far more. Part 8. What financial control actually looks like from the inside. Here's how to tell the difference between someone who has financial control and someone who is performing it. From the outside, they can look identical. Both may have similar incomes, similar lifestyles, similar surface behaviors around money. The difference is internal, and it's this. The person with genuine financial control is making decisions. The person without it is reacting to impulses they experience as decisions. The decision maker thinks, I'm choosing to buy this because it serves a purpose I've clearly identified. The reactor thinks, I deserve this. I worked hard. It's not that much. Everyone else has one. And then experiences the purchase as a choice, when what it actually was a relief behavior dressed in the language of preference. Machiavelli wrote that most men believe they act from reason, when in truth they act from passion, and then construct reason afterward. The rationalization is so fast and so practiced that it becomes invisible. The decision felt real, the logic felt genuine, but trace it backward, to what preceded the impulse, to what need it was serving, to what would have been felt if the purchase hadn't happened, and the real mechanism becomes clear. This is not about guilt, it's about vision. The person who can see their own mechanism, clearly, without self-judgment, with the same analytical eye they'd apply to any other system they wanted to improve. is the person who has taken the first step toward actual control. Because you can't redirect a force you can't see, and you can't see a force you've never examined. Part 9. The Rebuild. Here's what the psychological rebuild of a financial life actually involves, because this isn't a video that ends with the problem fully described and no direction forward. Step 1 is not a budget. It's a relationship audit. For 30 days, before changing a single financial behavior, simply observe. Notice every financial decision with the same curiosity you'd bring to studying an interesting stranger. Not judgment, curiosity. What preceded this? What need is this serving? What would it feel like to not do this? The purpose of this isn't to torture yourself with awareness of everything you're doing wrong. It's to surface the psychology underneath the behavior. The programming becomes visible in the observation. And visible programming can be questioned in a way that invisible programming never can. Step 2 is the identity question. Not what should my finances look like. That question belongs to the world of tactics. The prior question is, who would I need to be for my finances to work the way I want them to? What beliefs about money, about my own worthiness, about what's possible for someone like me would have to change? And what beliefs am I currently holding that are doing most of the damage? Machiavelli wrote that the reformer who changes the rules without changing the beliefs underlying them will see the old rules return in new forms. History bears this out at the level of kingdoms. It bears it out at the level of a personal budget too. Step 3 is the long game question. Not this month, not this year. What does financial control mean at the level of a decade? What are you actually trying to build? Not in financial terms, but in life terms. What does the life look like that this money is supposed to serve? Most people have never asked this question with genuine seriousness. And because it hasn't been asked, the financial life has no destination. It's just a series of transactions, managed with varying degrees of attention, drifting toward a retirement that was always abstract, always far away, always just over the next hill of obligations. Machiavelli had no patience for drift. He wrote that the man without a destination does not need a map, because all roads lead equally nowhere. Step 4 is the hardest, and it's the one almost nobody does fully. Remove as deliberately as you can as many of the comparison inputs as possible. This is not about ignorance. It's about reclaiming your own calibration. The benchmark for enough in your life should be set by your actual values, your actual goals, and your actual life, not by an algorithm designed to ensure the benchmark is always just out of reach. This step alone, even with nothing else changed, shifts financial behavior more than most people expect, because it removes one of the most powerful forces pushing unnecessary spending from underneath your notice. Part 10. The power that was always yours. Here's the truth that ties everything in this video together, and it's the one that matters most. Financial control is not something the system wants to give you, not because of any grand conspiracy, just because a financially sovereign person is a less reliable consumer, a less compliant employee, a less dependent participant in structures that run on your dependence. But financial sovereignty, psychological, behavioral, deeply internalized financial sovereignty, is also something nobody can actually prevent you from developing. It was never locked in a vault somewhere. It was never kept from you by force. It was kept from you by a set of beliefs, reflexes, and patterns that were installed so early and run so quietly that you never thought to question whether they were yours. They were never yours. They were given to you by people who were given them by people who were given them by people before that. A chain of financial programming that runs back through generations, each one inheriting the psychology of the one before it without ever examining whether it still made sense, or whether it ever made sense, or whether there was something fundamentally different available. There is something fundamentally different available. Machiavelli wrote that fortune does not control the man who has prepared a channel for it, that the river floods every year, but only the unprepared suffer its damage. The preparation is not complex, but it requires the one thing most people never commit to doing: looking honestly at the walls, not the financial walls, the psychological ones, the beliefs about what money is, the reflexes around what it's for, The identity investments that keep certain financial patterns locked in place. The programming that arrived before you had any say in the matter. Look at the walls. Name them, question them, and then decide, for the first time, with full consciousness, which ones you actually want to keep. The people who build real financial lives, not just the appearance of financial success, but actual sustained compounding financial autonomy, almost universally went through a moment that looked less like a financial decision and more like a psychological reckoning. A moment where they looked at their own relationship with money clearly enough and honestly enough to see the programming for what it was. Not a life sentence, just a program, one that could be rewritten. That rewrite is available to you right now, not the tactical version, not the budgeting app, the real one, the one that starts with the hardest question, not what should I do differently, but why am I doing what I'm doing at all? And whose voice is actually behind the answer? Most people will never ask that question, not because they can't, because it's easier to keep looking for a better tactic than to honestly examine the psychology underneath the tactics that keep failing. If you're not one of those people, if something in this video landed differently than a financial tip usually does, you already know what to do. Subscribe, because every video on this channel is designed to operate at this level. Not the surface of behavior, the architecture underneath it, the psychology of power, wealth, and human nature that most content never touches because most people never go looking for it. Those who do, they don't stay average, and they usually can't fully explain why.